If you have ever visited Hampton Court Palace in the winter, you already know the feeling. You walk in from the cold expecting a little bit of relief, and instead, nothing really changes. Your coat stays on, your shoulders stay hunched, your hands are still stiff. Even indoors, the air has that sharp, stone-cold bite that never quite leaves your lungs. It's not a little bit chilly. It's the kind of cold that settles into your bones and just stays there. Most people assume that's because the palace is empty now. No fires lit, no crowds, no servants bustling around. But for much of the Tudor period, this is very close to how it actually felt. In winter, many Tudor buildings were only a few degrees warmer inside than outside. Stone walls absorbed cold and held onto it. High ceilings pulled warmth upward and away from human bodies. Windows were thin, drafty, or boarded over entirely. Floors were stone or tile permanently cold underfoot. There was no concept of heating a building, only heating a person, briefly and pretty much always incompletely. Cold wasn't a seasonal annoyance, it was a constant condition of life. It dictated where people sat, how long they stayed awake, when work could be done, who gathered together. It shaped daily routines, social hierarchies, even the way people slept. Warmth was scarce, precious, and intensely local. You didn't wander through the house looking for comfort. You moved toward it, compressing life into a few square feet around a fire. And because heat was limited, everything else had to compensate. Clothing became insulation. Food was fuel in the most literal sense. Beds were sealed environments. Writing, reading, even conversation had to happen where fingers could still move and breath didn't fog the air. So when we talk about how the Tudors heated their homes, we're not really talking about technology in the modern sense. We're talking about rituals, daily negotiations with cold stone and darker afternoons, about a world where warmth was something you made, protected, sometimes shared, and stepping away from the fire, even inside, could mean real physical discomfort. Join me, my friends, today. Get comfy, grab a beverage, and let's discuss how the Tudors handled the cold. Hey friend, welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast. I am your host, Heather. I've been podcasting on Tudor England since 2009 with my show, which makes it the original Tudor history show. I am, as always, very excited that you are here with me today to talk about something that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately. Where I am in Pennsylvania, it hasn't been above freezing in the past 11 days, I think, is where we're at right now. And I'm starting to get really quite tired of it. I'm a whim. When I experience things like this, I often think, how did our Tudor friends handle this? And so I thought it would be fun to do an episode looking at how our Tudor friends managed life in the cold. I personally have been using a lot of hot water bottles and personal space heaters. My daughter has some of these rechargeable hand warmers that she uses for camping. So I've been using those, kind of tucking them in my pockets and things. Because honestly, if I kept the thermostat where I want it to be, the heating bill would be astronomical in this weather. The other morning, it was 8 degrees below zero, -8 in Fahrenheit, which in centigrade is -22. -22, my friend. I was not happy with that. I was not happy walking the dog with that. I was not happy getting out of bed with that. My coffee got cold so fast. So anyway, that's my personal share about the cold today. We are going to talk about how our Tudor friends handled the cold. So let's start with the fireplace. In a Tudor home, the fireplace wasn't just a feature. It was the organizing principle of daily life. Earlier, medieval homes had relied on a central open hearth with smoke drifting upward to a hole in the roof. By the Tudor period, brick chimneys were becoming more common. We've done whole episodes on chimneys, especially in wealthier households. Chimneys were expensive to build and required skilled labor, so having multiple fireplaces was a visible marker of status. You think about Hampton Court with all of those chimneys sticking up. It was definitely a mark of status. But even with this technological upgrade, the experience was far from comfortable. Fireplaces smoked, chimneys drew poorly, downdrafts were constant, Soot collected on walls, ceilings, clothing, and lungs, of course. A fire might heat the space immediately in front of it, but just a few steps away, the temperature dropped sharply. Heat rose and vanished into the upper reaches of high ceilings, leaving the people seated below with warm faces and cold backs. Fuel was another problem. Fires didn't burn themselves. Wood had to be chopped, hauled, stacked, dried, and rationed, of course. Charcoal was cleaner and burned hotter, but it was much more expensive. Coal was increasingly used by the late Tudor period, especially in London, but it produced a heavy smoke and an acrid smell that many people disliked. Keeping the fire burning all day was definitely a luxury, not a given. As a result, most households did not heat every room, they heated one room. In many homes, that room was the hall, or later a great chamber or withdrawing room. This was where people gathered not only because they wanted to socialize, but because it was the only place where warmth could be found. Furniture clustered tightly around the hearth. Benches, stools, and chairs were positioned to capture as much radiant heat as possible. The best seats were closest to the fire, and who got them was never accidental. This had practical consequences. Writing desks were pulled near the hearth, sewing was done there, meals were eaten there, not only because the food was served hot, but because it could be eaten before your hands went numb. Reading happened there in the uneven flicker of firelight because candles were expensive and daylight faded quickly in winter. Even the idea of privacy bent under the pressure of cold. People didn't disperse into separate rooms in the evening. They stayed together, shoulder to shoulder, sharing heat whether they wanted to or not. Conversations were overheard, arguments were public, silence was rare. Warmth demanded proximity. The fire also shaped diet. Food that could be cooked slowly and kept warm made sense. Pottages and stews simmered for hours, thickened with grains or vegetables. Hot drinks mattered less for hydration than for temperature. Warmed ale, spiced wine, or a posset served as a portable heater, something you could carry away from the hearth for a few minutes of sweet relief. Holding the vessel was as important as drinking from it. Hands wrapped around a warm cup absorbed heat directly. The chest warmed as steam rose to the face. This was not an indulgence, this was a strategy. Firelight, warmth, food, and company all converged in the same space. The fireplace didn't just warm bodies, it compressed life into a narrow radius. Step away from it, and the world immediately became colder, darker, and more difficult to inhabit. And because that warmth was limited, everything else in a Tudor household had to work harder to compensate. So Tudor people relied on something far more portable and far more personal, their clothing. In a modern home, clothing is optional comfort. In a Tudor house, it was insulation. People did not dress down indoors in winter. Cloaks stayed on, gowns were layered, sleeves were detachable and doubled. Wool dominated everyday clothing for survival, basically. Wool trapped heat in even when it was damp, and it created a buffer between the body and the cold air that crept in through every crack in the building. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and protected outer layers, but they did little to keep warmth in. The real work was done by heavy woolen garments, lined in better households with fur or additional layers of fabric. Fur trimming around collars and cuffs wasn't just decorations, my friend. Oh, no, no, no. It protected the neck and the wrists, two places where heat would escape from the body quite quickly. Hands were a particular problem. Fingers stiffened rapidly in cold air, making even simple tasks difficult. Gloves were worn indoors, but full gloves made it harder to sew and write and handle small objects. So people wore fingerless gloves. That was the practical compromise, keeping your wrists warm while leaving just your fingertips exposed enough to function. Sleeves were often pulled down over the hands when work was paused, trapping warmth wherever it could be found. For moments when clothing wasn't enough, portable heat could fill the gap. Foot warmers were small metal or ceramic containers filled with hot embers, designed to radiate heat slowly. They could be placed under a table, beneath a writing desk, or at someone's feet while they were seated. In church, where people were expected to sit or stand still for long periods in unheated stone buildings, foot warmers were particularly valuable. They allowed worshippers to remain upright and attentive rather than distracted by numb toes and aching joints. These devices were not without risk. Hot coals could scorch floors, burn clothing, or spill if jostled. Fire was always a controlled danger in Tudor life, necessary but never safe. The use of portable heat also reinforced social boundaries. Who had access to foot warmers, better clothing, or a closer seat by the fire was determined by your rank. Warmth was distributed unevenly, and everyone in the room could see it. The cold made hierarchy visible. All of this created a rhythm to daily life. People moved deliberately between warm and cold spaces. Tasks were planned around proximity to heat. You did what you could while your hands still worked, and then you retreated back toward the fire. Work, rest, conversation, and warmth were tightly interwoven. Cold shaped not just comfort, but behavior. It limited how long people stayed in one place, how far they wandered indoors, and how much could be done in a day. Even the simplest acts of reading, writing, sewing, or listening required warmth as a precondition. And nowhere was this more carefully managed than at night when the fire went out and the cold returned in full force. Keeping a fire burning overnight was expensive, labor-intensive, and very dangerous. Most fires were allowed to die down in the evening, and only banked coals might remain by morning. Bedrooms were not heated as a matter of course, and in many households they were among the coldest rooms, tucked away from the central hearth and exposed to drafts through thin walls and unsealed doors. Instead of heating the room, people heated the bed. The Tudor bed wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a carefully constructed thermal space. Heavy wooden frames supported thick mattresses stuffed with straw, flock, or feathers, all of which trapped heat more effectively than the air around them. Overhead testers and curtains enclosed the bed on all sides, creating a small chamber within the room. These bed hangings served several purposes. They blocked drafts, they retained body heat, and added a layer of insulation between the sleeper and the cold stone or plaster walls nearby. In wealthier households, the fabric might be wool or tapestry or lined silk. In humbler homes, coarse wool or layered cloth performed the same function. The goal wasn't beauty, but containment. Before anyone climbed in, the bed was often warmed. Warming pans were shallow metal pans attached to long handles filled with hot embers taken from the hearth. They were pressed carefully between the sheets, heating the bedding before sleep. The pan was then removed, the embers disposed of, and the bed quickly occupied before the heat dissipated. The process, of course, required a lot of attention and care because sparks could scorch fabric, and the smell of smoke often lingered in the sheets. Once inside, warmth depended on bodies. Sharing a bed was common, practical, and expected. Servants, the elite, sleeping alone was not the norm unless rank or circumstance required it. Body heat was a valuable resource, and wasting it made little sense. It reminds me of, in American history, John Adams and Ben Franklin, when they were traveling to France, they wrote in their diaries about, just sharing a bed. Well, they were traveling together, and it wasn't a big deal. Obviously, this is later than the Tudor period, but it was just mentioned in passing. It wasn't something that was mentioned as an oddity or anything like that. I think one of them, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think one of them had said, maybe it was John Adams, was complaining that Ben Franklin liked the room to be colder than he did, and it was a problem. And I think somebody was hogging the blankets or something. Anyway, it was quite funny. Obviously, this had nothing to do with intimacy in the modern sense. It was just a response to the cold. 2 or 3 bodies under heavy coverings produced a lot more warmth than one, and once that heat was established, it could be maintained through the night. Privacy was secondary, warmth came first. The rhythm of winter nights reflected this reality. People went to bed earlier not because they were tired, but because remaining awake in the cold was uncomfortable. Sleep became a way to conserve heat and energy. Long winter nights were endured rather than filled with cozy board games and activities. Rising in the morning meant, oh Lord, leaving the warmest place in the house. It's just so painful. Getting dressed was done quickly, often beneath the bedclothes or right beside them before the body had fully cooled. Only after returning to the hearth did hands loosen and breath steady. The bed, like the fireplace, was not about comfort in the modern sense, it was just about surviving. It was a controlled pocket of warmth in an otherwise cold interior world. For those who needed to think, read, or write before the fire was fully established, that cold posed a different kind of challenge entirely. Ink thickened in low temperatures. Pens became harder to control as fingers stiffened. Paper made from rag pulp could feel brittle and unresponsive in the cold air. These materials were used in spaces where breath fogged and hands struggled to stay flexible. Writing desks were therefore, like we said, placed as close to the fire as practical, not because it was pleasant and cozy, but because it was necessary. A desk too far from the hearth meant numb fingers, blotched letters, and shortened working time. Even then, the warmth was uneven. The face might be flushed while the back was freezing. One hand might stay warm while the other lost sensation. Lap desks offered a degree of mobility. They allowed writing to happen wherever warmth could be found, on a bench near the fire, beside a window during daylight, even in bed. Those were not indulgent accessories. They were adaptations to a world where fixed furniture could not guarantee usable conditions. Light compounded the problem. Winter days were short. Firelight flickered and shifted, casting shadows that strained the eyes. Candles were expensive and rationed. They were lit for specific tasks, not burned freely for ambiance like I like to. Reading and writing, therefore, happened in bursts, timed carefully to daylight and proximity to heat. Scholars, clerks, household managers planned their work around these constraints. Letters were written quickly, documents drafted and revised near the fire, often aloud, with others listening or assisting. Solitary intellectual labor conducted in silence and isolation was a luxury rarely afforded in cold months. Even simple acts required preparation. Hands were warmed before writing, sleeves were pulled down between sentences, gloves might be worn and removed repeatedly. Work paused when fingers lost sensation and resumed only after returning to the hearth. This changes how we think about books and learning in the Tudor world. Reading and writing were not cozy pursuits. They demanded physical endurance. They required access to warmth, light, and time, all of which were limited. The production of knowledge was shaped by the environment in which it occurred. Cold didn't merely inconvenience thought, it constrained it. It dictated when learning could happen, for how long, and under what conditions. In winter, intellectual life contracted toward the fire just as social life did. And when the fire went out, thinking stopped. When we imagine Tudor homes, it's easy to focus on the architecture, the timber beams, the stone walls, the great halls and private chambers. But the defining feature of indoor life wasn't what the buildings looked like, it was how cold they were. Heating in the Tudor period wasn't about warming spaces, it was about managing bodies. I hear this said a lot even today, warm the body, not the air. I have a wearable hot water bottle that I use, and I always think about that when I'm loading up my wearable hot water bottle. Anyway, clothing layered warmth where walls could not. Food provided heat as much as nourishment. Beds became sealed environments. Fire was a point of gravity around which life compressed and reorganized itself. This shaped everything. Social life was intense because people had to stay close. Privacy was limited because warmth demanded proximity. Work was fragmented and seasonal because fingers and daylights imposed hard limits. Even sleep was a strategy for enduring the cold rather than simply resting. Modern comfort is ambient and invisible. We heat entire buildings without even thinking about it. I turn my thermostat down during the day when my husband and daughter aren't here, and I turn it down to 65, which is pretty chilly, and I use my hot water bottle and stuff. But just the idea that I can, on demand, turn my thermostat from 65 back up to 70 or 72, like that's mind-blowing, right? In the Tudor world, warmth had to be created and protected and shared. It was temporary, fragile, and unevenly distributed. Understanding how the Tudors heated their homes means understanding how they lived inside of them. Cold stone, one fire, and a daily choreography built around staying warm enough to function. And once you see it that way, it's hard to walk through a place like Hampton Court again without imagining not just the grandeur, but the cold. So there you have it, my friend, a little bit on how our Tudor friends experienced the cold. I hope you learned something from this or thought about something you already knew in a different way. If you did and you enjoyed the video, I sure would appreciate a press of that like button. It helps to feed the algorithm and get our content to more people. And I hope that if I don't already have it, I earned your subscription wherever you're listening to this, if it's on YouTube or Spotify or any of the places. Thanks so much for being with me here today. Remember, my friend, you are deeply loved. I am so grateful I shared the planet with you. You make the world a better place. And I feel very blessed that we got to spend this time together today on a cold day talking about the Tudors. I do have a hot water bottle on my lap as I'm recording this, so feeling very Tudory with that. I hope you have an amazing day, my friend. I will be back again very soon. In the meantime, don't forget to drink your water. Bye-bye.